The day they buried Hester Bell's husband, 22 men came to offer their condolences, and every single one of them wanted something from her in return. The autumn of 1882 had come to Caldwell, Kansas with a particular cruelty, stripping the cottonwoods bare and leaving the plains exposed and gray beneath a sky the color of pewter. Hester stood beside the freshly turned earth of her husband's grave in the small church cemetery at the edge of town, her black dress pressed and proper, her dark hair pinned beneath a widow's veil, and she counted them as they came, the ranchers, the merchants, the foremen, the widowers. They pressed her hands with their thick, calloused fingers and spoke their practiced words of sympathy, and behind every one of those words was the same unspoken question. What are you going to do with the Bell Ranch now, Hester? What are you going to do with those 400 acres and that herd of 200 cattle and that deed with your name alongside your dead husband's? What are you going to do? A woman alone. Thomas Bell had been 31 years old when a fever took him in the space of 6 days. He had been strong and good and decent, and Hester had loved him in the way that a woman loves a man who treats her with kindness and never raises his voice fully, if not frantically. They had been married 4 years. They had worked that land together, side by side, building something real out of nothing but dust and determination. And now he was in the ground and the men were circling. Reverend Aldous concluded his final prayer, his voice carrying over the flat Kansas wind, and then the procession began. One by one they came to her. Calvin Marsh, who owned the mercantile and had always looked at Hester with something too warm in his eyes, took her hand and said how dreadfully sorry he was, and then suggested that perhaps she ought to think about selling off the north pasture, since managing so much land alone seemed like a tremendous burden for a woman of her delicate constitution. Frank Haller, the banker, told her Thomas had been a fine man, and then immediately mentioned that the Bell Ranch had 3 outstanding loans, and that she ought to come by his office at her earliest convenience. Old Pete Sommers, who was 58 years old and had buried 2 wives already, held her hand a full minute longer than was proper and told her that God's plan was mysterious, but that a woman like herself ought not to be alone too long, that loneliness was a terrible thing, and that he had a fine house. Hester thanked them all. She said the right words. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she did not cry, not because she had no grief in her, but because she refused to display it like a wound for these men to prod at. The grief was hers. Thomas had been hers. The land was hers, and she intended to keep it. She was 24 years old. She was not delicate. She was not lost. But by the time the 22nd man had pressed her hand and offered his condolences, with one eye already calculating what piece of the Bell operation he might acquire, something in Hester had gone cold and hard as winter iron. She was so tired of being looked at as a problem to be solved, a resource to be absorbed, a widow to be rescued. The autumn light was fading, turning everything amber and gold, and most of the mourners had drifted back toward their wagons when she became aware of a man standing at the edge of the cemetery fence. He was leaning against one of the wooden posts with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly, watching but not approaching. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in practical range clothes, dark canvas trousers, a worn leather vest over a blue shirt, boots that had seen serious miles. He had dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same blunt stone as the Kansas plains, and his eyes, when they met hers across the distance of the yard, were the particular brown of creek water in autumn, clear and steady and unhurried. Hester did not recognize him. She had a very good memory for faces. She had grown up in Caldwell and knew most of the county, and she did not know this man. He was watching her with an expression that was difficult to read from this distance. Not pity, not calculation, not the soft hunger that most of the other men had worn. He just looked at her, steady and quiet, and when their eyes met he gave a single small nod, the kind that conveyed acknowledgment without presumption, and then he turned and walked to where a bay horse was tied at the fence post, stepped up into the saddle in one smooth motion, and rode away into the fading afternoon. Hester watched him go and felt something she had not felt all day. She felt curious. She asked Margaret Plum about him the following morning. Margaret ran the boarding house on 2nd Street and knew everything about everyone in Caldwell and the surrounding territory. "That would be Walter Donovan," Margaret said, pouring Hester a cup of coffee and settling across the kitchen table with the satisfied air of a woman who has useful information. "He came through about 2 months back, hired on at the Rocking K as a ranch hand. Calvin Marsh tells me he was foreman at an outfit up in Colorado before, Cimarron Creek Ranch, but he sold his interest in it and moved on. Quiet sort. Pays his board regular, doesn't drink to excess, doesn't start trouble. One of the Rocking K boys said he's one of the best hands with horses they've seen." "Why was he at the funeral?" Hester asked. Margaret turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I couldn't say for certain. He never knew Thomas that I know of. Maybe he just paid his respects the way decent men do." Hester thought about the way every other decent man at that funeral had paid his respects and felt the difference sharpen into something she could almost hold. She did not go looking for Walter Donovan. She had a ranch to manage, and the week following Thomas's burial hit her like a wall. There was the herd to account for, and the 2 ranch hands, Amos and Pete Crane, brothers who had worked for Thomas for 2 years, who came to her with uncertain faces and asked whether they still had employment. She told them yes, of course, and paid them what was owed and mapped out a plan for the coming weeks with a confidence she had to work at sustaining in front of them, because she had done the math the night before and it was tight. Very tight. Frank Haller had not been wrong about the loans. Thomas had taken on debt to expand the herd in the spring, betting on good cattle prices at the Caldwell stockyards, and the prices had softened over the summer. There was enough to manage the ranch through winter if she was careful, if the cattle sold well in the spring, if nothing went wrong. Life in Caldwell in 1882 was one long string of ifs, and Hester Bell was better acquainted with them than most. She was mending harness leather in the barn on a Wednesday afternoon, 10 days after the funeral, when she heard a horse in the yard. She came out expecting Amos, who had ridden into town for supplies, and found instead the tall man with the Autumn Creek eyes standing with his bay horse's reins loose in his hand, looking at her barn roof with an appraising expression. "Mr. Donovan," she said. He looked at her and the surprise in his eyes was quick and genuine. "You know my name. This is a small town." She studied him openly the way she studied horses she was considering. He did not seem bothered by it. "Were you looking for Amos Crane? He's in town." "No, ma'am." He turned his hat in his hands again, that same motion from the cemetery. "I was looking for you." Hester folded her arms. "Why?" He looked at the barn roof again briefly and then back at her. "Your roof line is sagging on the west end. That's fresh damage from the last wind. You can see where the boards have shifted. You'll lose that section in the next hard rain if it isn't braced, and when it goes it'll take the loft with it." Hester turned and looked at the barn. She looked at the west end of the roof. She could see exactly what he was describing. She had looked at that barn every day for 4 years, and she had not noticed it because she had been looking at so many other things for so many days in a row that the roof had simply been there, stable, unquestioned. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Because it's going to rain by the weekend and you'll lose the barn otherwise." A pause. "I could fix it." Hester said nothing for a moment. She was deciding something. "In exchange for what?" she finally said. He shook his head slightly. "Nothing. I have 2 days off from the Rocking K. I'd rather be useful than not." She studied him for another long moment. "You came to Thomas's funeral," she said. "You didn't know him." "No," he said. "Then why?" He was quiet for a few seconds, and when he spoke it was with the careful deliberateness of a man who chose his words like a carpenter choosing the right wood for weight and grain and purpose. "I've ridden through a lot of towns and I've seen a lot of funerals," he said, "and sometimes a man can tell from the outside of a thing what the inside of it looks like. I rode past that cemetery and I could see that was a good burial for a man who was good to his people, and it seemed worth stopping for." It was not condolence. He was not apologizing for her loss or measuring it or offering to replace it. He was simply telling her what he had seen. "All right," Hester said. "The tools are in the barn. I'll have Amos help you when he gets back." Walter Donovan nodded and went to work. He had the roof braced by the time Amos rode in with the supply wagon, and by the time the light failed, they had replaced 3 sections of damaged timber and put new pitch on the seams. Hester made supper for all 3 of them: salt pork and beans and cornbread and strong coffee, and Walter ate with the uncomplicated appetite of a man who had worked hard and did not feel the need to fill silence with talk. He thanked her for supper. He said the beans were good. He said he thought the barn would hold through the winter now. He tipped his hat at the door and rode back toward the rocking K in the dark, and Amos Crane watched him go with an expression of moderate approval. "Good hand," Amos said. "Yes," Hester said, and she was already thinking about what she had noticed at the supper table, that Walter Donovan had looked at her, when she spoke, with the full attention of a person who intended to hear what she was actually saying. It rained on Saturday, a hard driving rain that came in off the plains with the particular fury that Kansas autumn delivered, and the Bell barn held. She sent a note to the rocking K thanking Walter Donovan for his work. He sent one back, short and plainly written, saying he was glad the barn had held and that if she needed anything she should not hesitate to ask. His handwriting was clear and unhurried, the letters evenly formed, the kind of writing that suggested a man who had been educated, past what his surroundings might lead you to expect. November came, and with it the first serious cold. Hester drove the herd to the south pasture where the windbreak of old cottonwoods offered some protection, and she worked alongside Amos and Pete Crane through the long cold days, checking fence line, breaking ice on the water troughs, tallying the herd. She was good at this work. She had always been good at it. Thomas had known that about her from the beginning and had never tried to keep her from it, which had been one of the things she had loved best about him. She saw Walter Donovan in town on a Thursday, at the feed store. He was loading 50-pound sacks of oats into a wagon with the efficient economy of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and he looked up when she came through the door and gave her that steady, acknowledging nod. She nodded back. Herschel Grant, who ran the feed store, told her the grain prices were rising and did she want to settle her account now or let it run through the winter, and while she was working through the arithmetic in her head, she heard Walter's quiet voice behind her. "Your south pasture fence, the eastern post line. 2 sections are down, near the creek crossing." She turned. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with the practical directness of one rancher informing another of a useful fact. "When did you see that?" she said. "Rode that way Tuesday. It was down then, might have cattle straying into the creek bottom." "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in the full and simple sense. She went and checked the fence line that same afternoon and found exactly what he had described. The posts had rotted at the base, and one hard freeze had finished them. She spent the better part of 2 days fixing it, and 3 of her cattle had indeed drifted into the creek bottom and had to be retrieved, which cost her a good deal of cold, muddy time, but could have been far worse if the whole herd had gone through. After that she began to notice that Walter Donovan seemed to ride past her land with some regularity, and every time he did he brought her some piece of useful information. Never advice about what she ought to do or suggestions that she was managing things incorrectly, just facts. The south pasture has standing water near the lower gate. The Crowley steer is limping on his front left. There is a family of skunks denning under your equipment shed. He delivered these observations with the same quiet directness every time, asked nothing in return, and went on his way. She was not so naive as to be unaware of what was happening. She had been raised in Kansas by a practical mother and a ranching father, and she understood that a man who keeps finding reasons to ride past a woman's property is a man who is interested in that woman. But Walter Donovan's method of expressing that interest was so entirely unlike every other form of male attention she had received since Thomas died that she found herself not irritated by it, but increasingly, cautiously, curious about it. She started looking for him in town. She told herself this was practical. He often had useful information, but she knew the truth of it, which was that she had begun to look forward to those brief, sensible, uncomplicated conversations in a way she had not looked forward to much of anything since the fever had taken Thomas. She ran into him at Margaret Plum's boarding house one evening in early December when she had come to pay a debt she owed Margaret for some mending. He was sitting by the parlor fire with a book, an actual book, which surprised her, and he stood when she came in with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised right. "What are you reading?" she asked, because she wanted to know. He showed her the spine. It was a collection of survey reports from the Federal Geological Survey. She looked up at him. He looked mildly embarrassed. "I find them interesting," he said. "Why?" He thought about it for a moment. "Because they describe what's actually there. Not what people think ought to be there. What actually is." She stood in Margaret's parlor with the firelight moving over them both and thought that this was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever heard a man say about why he liked to read, and she felt something shift in her chest in a way she was not entirely prepared for. "I have a copy of Clarence King's Systematic Geology," she said. "Thomas ordered it from a catalog 2 years ago. I could lend it to you." His expression changed in a way she found she very much liked, a quiet brightening, the kind that could not be performed. "I would like that very much." She brought the book to town the following week and found him at the Rocking K's account at the feed store, settling the outfit's expenses, and she handed it across the counter, and he took it with the careful hands of a man who understood that things worth having deserve to be treated accordingly. Their fingers touched briefly on the spine of the book, and the contact was so minor and yet so present that Hester felt it in her pulse and was faintly annoyed at herself for it, and then decided that being annoyed at herself for feeling anything was a waste of her time. "Thank you, Mrs. Bell," he said. "Hester," she said. A pause. "Hester," he said, and the way her name sounded in his mouth was like it had finally been pronounced correctly for the first time. December deepened into genuine cold, the kind that turned the ground iron-hard and made the cattle's breath rise in great white clouds, and made the windows of the Bell Ranch house run with frost on the inside. Hester managed through it, kept the herd alive and the hands paid and the loans from defaulting, and she did it through sheer organized determination and a profound stubborn refusal to believe that any of it was beyond her. It was during the worst cold snap of December, when the temperature had dropped past the point where rational people went outside, that she discovered her water pump had frozen solid. She tried everything she knew. She poured heated water down the pump shaft. She wrapped the pipe with wool. She broke through the ice in the trough by hand with an axe and hauled water bucket by bucket for the cattle, which was exhausting work that she could not ask Amos or Pete to take on entirely by themselves. By the second day her hands were raw and cracked from the cold, and she was so tired that the world had gone slightly unsteady at its edges, and that was when she heard horses in the yard and looked out the frost-clouded window and saw Walter Donovan, and one of the Rocking K hands she knew only as Dutch riding in with a pack mule loaded with pipe fittings and tools. She opened the door. The cold was like a physical force against her face. "The pump," Walter said without preamble. "Frozen through," she said. "Second day." He nodded, studying the pump in the yard, and then looked at her hands where she had not thought to hide them, and his expression did something careful and controlled that she was beginning to recognize as the closest thing to strong emotion that Walter Donovan permitted himself to show outwardly. "We'll have it running before dark," he said. He and Dutch worked the entire afternoon in that killing cold, and they had the pump running again by the time the sun went behind the plains. Hester made coffee and something hot for all of them, and they sat in the ranch house kitchen, Dutch doing most of the talking while Walter was quiet in his way, and Hester watched Walter's hands as he warmed them on the coffee cup, and thought about the fact that he had ridden out in this cold on his free time with tools and a pack mule because her pump was frozen. After Dutch rode out, Walter was tightening the last of the fittings at the pump in the yard, and Hester stood in the doorway with a lantern. "You keep doing things," she said. He looked up. "What's that?" "You keep doing things for this ranch, for me. You ask for nothing." She studied his face in the lantern light. "I want to know why." He stood up from the pump and was quiet for a moment, and the only sounds were the wind moving over the plains and the distant low of cattle. Then he looked at her with those steady Autumn Creek eyes and said, "Because I would like to know you, Hester Bell, and I don't know a better way to begin than to make myself useful." It was the simplest, most straightforward declaration of interest she had ever heard, and it struck her somewhere behind the sternum like a tuning fork struck against something true. "You could simply say so," she said. "I am saying so," he said. "Right now." She held the lantern between them in the cold Kansas night, and she made a decision that she recognized as significant. "Come to supper on Sunday," she said. "Not to fix anything, just to supper." He said, "I'd like that very much." And this time the quiet brightening in his face was unmistakable. He came to Sunday supper, and it was the best conversation Hester had had in longer than she could immediately recall. Walter talked about Colorado, about the years he had spent at the Cimarron Creek outfit, about the mountains, and what the high country looked like in summer when the meadows went green above the timberline. He talked about horses with the thoroughness of a man who had thought deeply about them, not just as working animals, but as individual creatures with distinct characters and preferences. And this matched precisely how Hester herself thought about horses, and she found this almost unreasonably pleasing. She talked about her father's ranch in the Flint Hills, about learning to read cattle by the way they moved and held their ears, about the year of the great blizzard of 1873, when she had been 15 years old, and the snow had been so deep the cattle had suffocated standing up, and her father had been so broken by it that he had sold the ranch and moved the family into Caldwell, and never been quite the same man again. She had not talked about that in years. She had not talked about the particular grief of watching a person you love lose the thing that gave them their identity, and somehow the words came out naturally in Walter Donovan's presence, as though the air around him was the kind that permitted true things to be said in it. "Is that why you stayed when Thomas died?" he said. "Why you didn't sell?" She thought about it. "Partly," she said, "and partly because I built that land too. It's mine as much as it was his, maybe more than some people understand." Walter looked at her across the table in a way that told her he understood it exactly. "More than most people understand," he said quietly. They sat in that kitchen for 3 hours after the supper dishes were cleared, and at the end of it, when he had put on his coat and hat and was at the door, he turned and said, "May I call on you again, in the proper way, not to fix anything?" "Yes," she said. The December cold outside was the same as it had always been, but Hester Bell stood in her kitchen after the sound of his horse had faded down the ranch road, and felt something in her chest that was warm and alive and distinctly inconvenient for a woman who had told herself she was not going to feel this way again for a very long time. He called the following Sunday, and the one after that. January 1883 arrived, and with it a brief thaw that made the plains brilliantly alive with winter light. They rode the Bell Ranch property together on the second Sunday of January, checking fence line as a practical pretext for the pure pleasure of riding side by side through the low gold light, and Hester showed him the Bell land the way she would show someone a piece of herself. The creek bottom where the willows grew and the deer came to drink, the high swell of the south pasture where you could see 50 miles on a clear day. The particular stand of old cottonwoods that Thomas had called the Parliament, because there were 11 of them, and they stood in a loose, rough circle as though in conference. Walter listened to all of it with the quality of attention she had come to recognize as one of his most particular and valuable characteristics, a complete, quiet attention that did not calculate or plan while it listened, but actually received what was being said. He asked questions that showed he had heard. He remembered details from things she had mentioned weeks before. They sat their horses at the top of the south pasture rise and looked out across the 50-mile view, and the silence between them was the easy kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. "What happened to the Cimarron Creek outfit?" Hester asked. "You said you sold your interest." "I did." He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the plains. "My partner wanted to run it differently than I did. More cattle, less land. Push it harder than the grass could recover from. I thought he was wrong. He thought I was wrong. We couldn't resolve it, so I sold out and moved on." "Do you think he's going to ruin the land?" "I think he's going to try to get rich fast enough that it doesn't matter to him when the grass goes," Walter said, and there was a flatness in his voice that was the sound of a man who had given a thing up and still felt the wound of it. Men like that are everywhere. They see land as a thing to take from, not a thing to tend. Hester thought of Frank Haller and Calvin Marsh and all the other men who had looked at her 400 acres with calculating eyes. "I know the type," she said. Walter looked at her. "You've been handling them off your property since before Thomas was buried." "Yes," she said simply. "You're very good at it." "I am," she agreed, and he laughed, a short, genuine, warm sound, and she felt the pleasure of it move through her like the first real warmth of early spring, tentative and extraordinary. They rode back to the ranch house in the last of the afternoon light, and at the gate he turned his horse, and she turned hers, and they sat facing each other in the gray-gold dusk. And Hester thought that she had been afraid, since Thomas died, of wanting things, of committing the heart's resources to something that could be taken away in 6 days by a fever. She had thought that fear was protective. Standing here in the January cold looking at Walter Donovan's face, she thought the fear was simply fear and that it had been keeping her from something real. "Walter," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was careful. "I want to ask you something directly." "All right." "When you came to that funeral," she said, "and then when you came to fix the barn roof and everything after, were you from the beginning interested in me, or did that come later?" He was quiet for just a moment. Then, with the characteristic honesty that she had come to rely on the way you rely on a good compass. "Both," he said. "I saw you in that cemetery and I thought you were the most," he paused, choosing his word carefully, "the most present person there. You were surrounded by grief and by people using grief to their own ends, and you were simply there in the full weight of it, holding yourself together without pretending it was easy. I thought, here is a person worth knowing, and then everything after was about knowing you, and what I found was worth considerably more than I had hoped." Hester looked at him in the dusk, and her heart was doing something loud and certain in her chest. "I think," she said, "that you should know that I feel the same way. I am telling you this directly because I believe in telling people true things." "I know you do," he said. "It's one of the best things about you." She reached across the small distance between their horses, and he took her hand, right there in the January cold, and they held that contact for a long, quiet moment that rearranged something fundamental in both of them. "Come to supper next Sunday," she said. "I'll be here," he said. February arrived, and with it the complex business of planning the spring cattle drive to the Caldwell stockyards. Hester needed her herd to sell well. Everything depended on the spring prices, and prices at the Caldwell yards in 1883 were going to be determined in part by how well the cattle arrived, their weight, their condition, their temperament at the pens. She had been watching the herd all winter, and she knew what she had. What she needed was a foreman she could trust to help her run the drive, because Amos and Pete Crane were good hands, but neither of them had run a drive before, and Thomas had always led that operation himself. She was thinking this through at the kitchen table one evening, tallying figures by lamplight, when she found herself reaching the obvious conclusion before she had quite intended to. She set down her pen and looked at the wall for a moment and then said, aloud, to no one, "Well, obviously." She asked Walter the following Sunday, but she asked him carefully, because she understood that what she was proposing had layers to it beyond simple employment. Walter was a ranch foreman by training and experience. She was offering him the foreman role for the spring drive, but they were also, by this point, in the middle of something real and growing between them, and she wanted to make sure that the offer was separate from the feeling that she was not trading on one to get the other. "I want to hire you to run the drive," she said, "as foreman, at fair wages, what you get anywhere else. I want to be clear that I am asking you as a rancher asking a qualified man, not as a woman asking a man." She stopped herself. Walter looked at her steadily. "Finish that," he said. She held his gaze. "A man she cares for." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the range ticked. "Those are two separate things," Walter said, "and I can keep them separate if you can." "I can," she said. "Then yes," he said. "I'll talk to the Rocking K tomorrow. They've been expecting me to move on." He was right. The Rocking K let him go without hard feelings, with a handshake and a week's pay beyond what was owed. By the 1st of March, he was at the Bell Ranch every day, working the herd with Amos and Pete Crane, assessing the cattle with the careful, systematic eye of a man who had been doing this for 15 years and had learned to read an animal's prospects with something approaching certainty. He did not move into the ranch house, which would have been improper and which they both understood without discussion. He rode out from town each morning and rode back each evening, a routine that Hester noted with the private warmth of a woman who has become accustomed to the particular sound of a certain horse on her ranch road and feels the absence of it when the sound stops. They worked well together, which surprised neither of them by now. They had the same ideas about how cattle ought to be managed patiently, with minimal stress, understanding that an animal that arrives calm to the market is worth more than an animal that has been pushed and harassed the whole way. They agreed about water stops and rest days and how to handle the inevitable stragglers. When they disagreed, about which route to take to avoid a stretch of bad road, about whether a particular steer was healthy enough for the drive, they argued it out directly and came to a conclusion, and neither of them nursed the argument afterward. Amos Crane told his brother Pete, who told Margaret Plum, who told approximately half of Caldwell, that Mrs. Bell and her new foreman worked together like they had been doing it for 20 years, and that he had never seen the boss so sure-handed going into a spring drive, and that it was a good outfit right now, a real good outfit. Hester heard this secondhand and felt a fierce proprietary pride that she recognized had as much to do with Walter as with the herd. March brought a particular complication in the form of Calvin Marsh. Calvin Marsh had not given up on his ambitions regarding Hester Bell and the Bell Ranch, and the sight of Walter Donovan riding out to the Bell property every morning had narrowed something behind his eyes. He came to Hester at the feed store on a Tuesday with the manner of a man delivering a kindness, and told her that he had heard she had taken on Walter Donovan as foreman, and that he thought she ought to know that a man named Donovan, who had previously worked at the Cimarron Creek Ranch in Colorado, was considered something of a troublemaker by some accounts, a man who couldn't work with partners, a man who left operations in disorder. Hester looked at Calvin Marsh with a level, unhurried gaze. "Where did you hear this?" she said. "A man I do business with up in Pueblo mentioned it," Calvin said. "What is this man's name?" Calvin hesitated. "I don't see what his name," Hester said. Calvin told her a name. She filed it away. "Thank you for telling me," she said, which Calvin took as evidence that she had been persuaded, and he left looking satisfied. That evening Hester told Walter what Calvin had said, watching his face as she did. Walter's expression was flat and steady and not surprised. "The man in Pueblo would be my former partner," he said. "Jedediah Cross, the one who wanted to push the land past what it could hold. He was not pleased when I sold out. He's told that story up and down the Colorado trade routes for 2 years. Is any part of it true?" she said. "I left the partnership because I disagreed with the management," he said. "Whether that constitutes troublemaking depends on whose side you're on." She looked at him. "I know which side I am on," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with something that was not quite a smile but was warmer than his ordinary expression, "I know you do." She wrote a letter to a rancher she knew in Pueblo, a man named Grady Holland who had done business with the Cimarron Creek outfit and whom she trusted to give her a straight account. The reply came back in 10 days and confirmed what she had expected, that Walter Donovan had run the Cimarron Creek operation competently for 3 years, that he had left after a dispute with his partner over land management, that he was regarded by the working hands as one of the fairest and most capable foremen in the Colorado Range country. Jedediah Cross, the letter noted, had since pushed the Cimarron Creek grass into serious degradation and was in financial difficulty. She showed Walter the letter. He read it without expression and handed it back. "You checked," he said, and there was something in his voice that she could not quite read. "Of course I checked," she said. "I am a careful person." "I know you are," he said. "I was going to say I'm glad you checked. A woman who trusts without verifying in this country doesn't stay a landowner long." He paused. "Or safe." "No," she agreed. He was looking at her with an expression that had something serious and particular in it, something that had been building for months in the careful space between them. "Hester," he said. "Yes," she said, and she knew, from the way he said her name, what was coming. "I would like to speak plainly," he said. "I have always preferred it," she said. He was quiet for a moment that had weight and intention in it. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for several months. I have been patient because I wanted you to be sure of yourself and sure of me before anything was said, but I find I can't go on indefinitely not saying it." He looked at her with those clear, steady eyes. "I don't want to be only your foreman. I would like the right to ask you to marry me. Not now, not until you're ready, and not until we've run this drive and you've settled the loans and you're standing on solid ground. But I want you to know that is my intention, if you'll permit me." The evening light was falling across the kitchen floor in long oblique bars of gold. Hester sat across the table from this man who had fixed her barn and her pump and ridden her fence lines, and never once looked at her as anything other than her full and particular self, and she felt the grief of losing Thomas and the fear of losing again move through her cleanly, like a wave that passes rather than one that drowns. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been since approximately the conversation about the geological survey, which I recognize as a strange moment to have become certain about such a thing." He laughed, that short, genuine, warm sound, and it was the best sound in the kitchen. "Then we understand each other," he said. "We have always understood each other," she said, and she reached across the table and he took her hand, the same way he had in the dusk at the pasture gate in January, and this time neither of them let go for a long time. April came with its alternating violence and beauty, great storms rolling off the plains followed by days of extraordinary clarity and warmth, and the Bell Ranch went into the final preparations for the cattle drive with a focused energy that Hester found deeply satisfying. Walter managed the preparation with the smooth competence of long experience, worming the cattle, checking hooves, culling the 3 steers that weren't going to make the drive, organizing the supplies and equipment that Amos and Pete would carry in the wagon. Caldwell in 1883 was a cattle town in the particular sense that the cattle trade determined everything: prices, moods, weather patterns of wealth and poverty. The Kishom Trail, which had once brought the great longhorn herds up from Texas through Indian Territory to the Kansas rail towns, was winding down as the railroads pushed south and east, but there was still money to be made in beef at the Caldwell yards for an outfit that arrived with good cattle and good timing. Hester had done her arithmetic. If the herd came in well and the prices held, she would clear the Bell Ranch debt and have enough left over to run through another year. The night before the drive, Walter came to supper, and they sat across from each other with the comfortable ease of 2 people who have come to know the shape of each other's company. And Hester thought that this man at her table, the lamplight between them, the cattle quiet in the south pasture, the evening full of the particular smell of approaching spring, was the most purely good moment she had felt in a very long time. "Are you ready?" he said. "I've been ready since February," she said, and he smiled. "You have," he agreed. "Are you?" she said. He looked at her. "For the drive, yes. For everything else," he paused. "I've been ready for that since the cemetery." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "The drive lasted 5 days. They took 87 head to the Caldwell yards, a carefully selected cut of the Bell herd. Walter ran it as she had expected him to, calmly, efficiently, with a patience with the cattle and the men that made the whole operation feel less like work and more like a well-practiced skill. There were no stampedes, no injuries, no losses. The cattle arrived at the yards in good condition and in good temper. The prices were better than Hester had dared hope. A wet winter had meant thin herds from South Texas, and the Caldwell buyers were hungry for good beef. She stood at the stockyard rail and watched the Bell cattle move through the pens and listened to the auctioneer's voice rising, and she felt each price called like a small stone dropping into still water, sending out rings. When it was over, she went to the cattle office and collected the payment and walked out into the May afternoon with enough money in the bank draft she carried to clear every Bell Ranch debt and have considerable left over. And she stood in the Caldwell Street with the sun warm on her face and felt something release in her chest that she had been holding since the day Thomas died. Walter was waiting outside with the horses. He looked at her face and read it correctly as he always did. "Good," he said. "Very good," she said, and the smile that came onto her face was one she felt in her whole body. He smiled back fully, which was rare enough that she always catalogued it. "Good," he said, and the word carried everything. She paid Amos and Pete their drive bonus that evening, and they were grateful and loyal, and she was glad of them. She wrote a check to Frank Haller the following morning and walked it into the bank herself, and Frank Haller, to his modest credit, congratulated her on managing the operation so well, and she thanked him in the tone of a woman who does not particularly need to be congratulated for doing what she said she would do. Calvin Marsh was less gracious. He stopped her outside the mercantile the following week with a face arranged into concern. "I hear you're keeping Donovan on," he said. "As foreman," she said. "People talk, Hester," he said, and there was something beneath the concern that was the oldest kind of social pressure, the suggestion that a widow woman keeping a man around was a matter for public comment. Hester looked at him with a patience that had very sharp edges. "People talk about everything in this town, Calvin," she said. "I find I don't concern myself much with the opinions of men who try to buy my land from me at a funeral." Calvin Marsh went pink. You suggested I sell the north pasture while I was standing over my husband's grave," she said, pleasantly but precisely. "I remember it clearly. Good morning." She walked away and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has said the exact right true thing. She told Walter about it that evening, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You know he's going to be a problem until it's settled." "Settled how?" she said. He looked at her. "Until there is no ambiguity about the situation, about us." She held his gaze. "Is that a roundabout way of saying something more direct?" He set down his coffee cup with the deliberate care of a man who is about to do something significant. He reached into his vest pocket and put a ring on the table between them. It was simple gold with a small dark garnet, and it was clearly not new, clearly something that had been carried for a time. "That was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me when I left Colorado. She said," he paused. "She said she trusted me to know when the right person came." He looked at Hester with those steady, clear eyes. "I've known since January. I've been waiting for the right moment, and I am now of the opinion that waiting for the perfect moment in this territory is a form of cowardice, and I don't believe in it." Hester looked at the ring on the table. She looked at Walter Donovan. She thought about Thomas, who had been good and kind and who would have, she believed with her whole heart, wished her exactly this man in her kitchen with this ring between them and this feeling in her chest. She thought about the 22 men at the funeral and the one man who had stood at the fence and asked nothing and then spent months making himself useful, and then told her the truth plainly in the lamplight. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Walter Donovan." He reached across the table and picked up the ring and came around to her side, and she stood, and he put the ring on her hand, and she looked up at him, and he kissed her for the first time, there in the lamplight of the kitchen of the Bell Ranch. with the spring night outside the window and the sound of the cattle in the distance. And it was the kind of kiss that does not need to establish anything because it already knows what it is, steady and warm and fully arrived. The way a thing feels when it has been true for a long time and has finally been said aloud. They stood together in the kitchen for a long time after, her head against his chest and his arms around her, and the fire ticked in the range, and the night was quiet and good. They told Margaret Plum first, because Margaret would find out within the hour regardless, and it was better to tell her directly. Margaret wept with happiness and hugged Hester with tremendous force, and shook Walter's hand with a grip that made him blink, and said she would make the cake herself, and did not want to hear a single word of argument about it. Reverend Aldous, who had buried Thomas and knew Hester's character well, told her in private that he thought this was a blessed thing, and that he was glad to see her so obviously well. He looked at Walter with the careful assessment of a man who takes his responsibilities seriously, and then shook his hand with evident approval. Even Frank Haller, whom Hester had not expected to be gracious, offered genuine congratulations and noted that the Bell Ranch was in fine shape financially, and that it was good to see a sound outfit remain in capable hands. Calvin Marsh did not offer congratulations, but he stopped making pointed observations about Walter's presence at the ranch, which was the closest thing to graciousness that Hester expected from him and which was, she decided, sufficient. They were married on a Saturday in June 1883 in the same church where Thomas Bell lay in the cemetery outside. Hester wore a dress the color of cream, which was the dress she had been married in the first time, altered and let out and taken in to fit the woman she was now rather than the girl she had been. She had thought about wearing black, and then decided that the only proper color for the day she was marrying Walter Donovan was the color of something that had grown toward the light. Walter stood at the front of the church in his good coat and his good hat, and when she came down the aisle he looked at her with an expression that was the entire worth of the past year compressed into a single moment of pure feeling on a man's face who did not often let feeling show outwardly, and she found that her eyes were full, which she had not expected. Amos and Pete Crane sat in the front pew on the groom's side because Walter had no family within 1,000 miles, and the Crane brothers were the closest thing to an outfit family any of them had, and Amos cried openly and Pete pretended he was not crying, and neither of them was convincing. The vows were the traditional ones, and Hester meant every word of them with the weight of a woman who has lost and built and chosen and arrived. And when Reverend Aldous said the final words and Walter kissed her in front of everyone, the small church made a sound that was approximately the combined satisfaction of a community that has watched a story find its proper shape. The summer of 1883 was one of the best seasons the Bell Ranch had ever seen. Hester and Walter ran the operation together with the deep, practiced efficiency of two people who have worked long enough in parallel that their movements have become complementary. They divided the labor not according to what was traditionally men's work and women's work, but according to what each of them was best at, which meant that Hester ran the books and managed the cattle sales and made decisions about the herd composition and the breeding program, and Walter managed the range conditions and the equipment and the hands. And both of them rode every corner of those 400 acres on a regular basis, because both of them understood that land only gives back what you know it and tend it properly. They added a ranch hand in July, a young man named Rafael Vargas who had come up from Texas and who was 19 years old and who could ride and rope with a skill that made Amos Crane honestly envious. Rafael had come looking for work at the rocking K, but Walter had spoken to him first and recognized what he was looking at, and had offered him better wages than the rocking K would likely have done, and Rafael had accepted and turned out to be not only a superb hand, but also a steady, quiet young man with good judgment and a profound affection for the Bell Ranch horses. The Bell horses were something of a particular project for Walter, who had begun, in the early summer, to put his ideas about a breeding program to Hester with the careful tentativeness of a man who is proposing to expand an enterprise that belongs to someone else even if that person has also become his wife. Hester listened to the whole plan, which involved acquiring 2 good mares from a rancher in the Flint Hills who raised particularly sound-limbed horses with strong temperaments, and said yes before he had quite finished explaining it, because she had been thinking about the same thing independently for 3 months. He looked at her across the table. "You've been thinking about this already." "Since March," she said. He shook his head slightly with that particular expression he wore when she surprised him, which still happened regularly despite how well they knew each other and which she had come to treasure. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I was waiting to see how you'd present the idea," she said. "I wanted to know how thorough your reasoning was." "And very thorough," she said. "You covered almost everything I'd thought of." "Almost." She pushed her notes across the table. He looked at them. He was quiet for a moment. "The water availability in the North Pasture in late summer," he said. "I hadn't accounted for that." "I know," she said. He looked up at her with that full, warm expression that was the private version of Walter Donovan, the one that was not available to the public world, but only to her in the kitchen in the evenings, when they sat across the table from each other, and the lamp was burning and the world outside was the quiet Kansas night. "What would I do without you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "Much less well," she said, and he laughed, and she felt the laugh in her chest, in the place where things had been cold for a long time and were now warm. They brought the mares from the Flint Hills in August, 2 bay horses with the deep chests and strong legs of proper working stock, and Hester named them Cleo and Vera, which Walter pretended were unusual names for horses while clearly finding them endearing. Rafael Vargas took charge of the new horses with such obvious pride and competence that Hester raised his wages by the end of the month, which made him go quiet with a gratitude that was briefly painful to watch because it was so genuine. The fall roundup and the second cattle drive of the year, a smaller fall drive, went as well as the spring had gone. Hester stood at the stockyard rail again in October and listened to the prices, and felt the same deep satisfaction that she associated now with the certainty that the Bell Ranch would stand another year, and then another. That fall she discovered she was expecting a child. She told Walter on a quiet Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table over after-supper coffee, and she watched his face as she said the words. What happened to his face was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. A complete, unguarded joy. The kind that a man like Walter Donovan spent most of his life keeping carefully controlled. And for just a moment she saw it fully, naked and certain and enormous. He came around the table and took her hands and held them in both of his and looked at her with those clear, steady eyes that were currently quite distinctly bright. "Are you well?" he said. "How are you feeling? Do you need anything? I want to know immediately if you need anything." "I need you to sit down," she said, laughing. "I am perfectly fine, Walter. Women have babies in this territory every day." "Not my women," he said. The phrase settled over her like something warm. "My women." Not possessive in the cold sense, in the sense of belonging which ran both ways. "Not your women," she agreed. "But I am telling you that I am well and I intend to remain well, and the only thing I currently need is for you to stop looking at me as though I might break." He sat down and looked at her in a way that was slightly less alarmed and deeply, unmistakably tender. "A baby," he said. "In the spring," she said. "April, I think." He held her hands. "The Bell Ranch in the spring," he said. "New horses and a new baby." He looked at her steadily. He stopped. "What?" she said. "I never thought I would have this," he said quietly. "I'm 41 years old and I spent most of my life thinking that the work was what there was. The ranch, the cattle, the horses, the work." And now he looked at her with an expression of a man who is not sure the present moment is fully real because it exceeds what he had allowed himself to imagine. "Now I have all of this." She squeezed his hands. She thought of the man at the fence at the cemetery, hat in hand, watching but not approaching. She thought of every practical act of care that had been, underneath its practicality, a form of devotion so patient and consistent that it had arrived without drama and without demand. She thought of offering a future instead of condolence. She thought that this was what a future looked like from the inside: a kitchen, a lamp, two hands holding, a spring coming. "You have all of this," she said. "We," he said, correcting himself. "We," she agreed. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a mild one by Kansas standards, which felt like a grace. Hester managed the ranch through her pregnancy with the determined practicality that characterized everything she did, ceding the more physical work to Walter and the Crane brothers and Raphael as the months advanced, but refusing to cede the management decisions or the books or the 100 daily small choices that kept an operation running well. Walter was, in the matter of her pregnancy, protective in a way that was touching rather than restricting, because he was always careful to protect her person while never presuming that her person required protection from her own judgment. He built a cradle during the winter evenings, working at it in the barn by lamplight with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and Hester would sometimes come to the barn door with his evening coffee and watch him working and feel the particular sweetness of a life that was being built rather than merely lived. Margaret Plum came to call regularly through the winter, bringing food and gossip in roughly equal measure, and presided over the whole situation with the satisfied authority of a woman who considers herself personally responsible for the happiness of everyone she likes. She had not, she pointed out to Hester on one of these visits, been entirely wrong to mention Walter Donovan immediately when Hester had asked about him, which Hester acknowledged was accurate and which seemed to please Margaret enormously. Amos and Pete Crane were openly delighted about the coming baby. Pete, who was less reserved than his brother, had taken to referring to the unborn child as Little Bell, with a cheerful presumption of familiarity that Hester found she did not mind at all, and Amos had carved a small wooden horse and left it on the kitchen table one morning without comment, which was the most purely sweet gesture Hester had received in some time. Raphael Vargas said nothing, because he was young and somewhat shy about certain kinds of feeling, but he had been quietly repairing the fence around the kitchen garden without being asked, and Hester noticed this and made a note of it, and thought that Raphael Vargas was going to be a good man, if he was not already one. April arrived, and with it the particular wild Kansas spring, the sky enormous and alternately violent and brilliant, the grass coming up green and urgent, the cottonwoods putting out their first tentative leaves. On the 14th of April, 1884, Hester Bell Donovan gave birth to a son. He was a large, healthy, indignant baby who announced his presence in the world at considerable volume, and then quieted immediately when Walter picked him up and held him with the careful arms of a man handling something irreplaceable. He looked down at the baby with an expression that Hester would carry in her memory for the rest of her life: pure, undefended love, sitting on the face of a man who had spent decades presenting the world with something considerably more contained. "He has your eyes," Walter said. "He has your jaw," Hester said from the bed. "The poor child." Walter looked up at her, and the expression on his face was the same one from the kitchen table when she had told him the news in October, that naked, extraordinary joy, and this time it was larger and more permanent, bedded deep in him like good roots. They named him James Thomas Donovan. James for Walter's father, and Thomas for the man whose land and legacy had made all of this possible, because Hester believed in honoring what was true, and Thomas Bell had been true, and he deserved to have his name carried forward in the place he had loved and built. James Thomas Donovan proved to be a baby of considerable personality. He was interested in everything, loud about most of it, and had a particular affinity for horses that manifested itself before he could walk in the form of a visible excitement whenever he heard hooves in the yard. Rafael Vargas appointed himself the baby's most devoted admirer among the ranch hands, and by the time James was 6 months old, Rafael had made him a small leather bracelet tooled with horses that James wore until it fell apart, and which Hester kept in the kitchen drawer afterward. The Bell Ranch in the fall of 1884 was the most productive it had ever been. The horse breeding program was underway, with Cleo and Vera having produced 2 foals in the spring. One a fine dark bay colt that Walter said had as good a leg as he had seen at that age, and the other a gray filly that Hester named Meridian and felt an immediate proprietary fondness for. The cattle herd was at its best composition yet, 3 years of careful selection and management showing in the quality of the animals. Walter had, over the preceding year, acquired a quiet but solid reputation in Caldwell and the surrounding range country as one of the most capable ranch managers in the area. Men who ran operations 3 times the size of the Bell Ranch had begun to come to him for informal advice, which he gave freely and practically, and this was a source of considerable pride to Hester, not because she required him to be impressive, but because she had known from the beginning what he was, and it was deeply satisfying to watch the rest of the world arrive at the same conclusion. Frank Haller, who had evolved over the 2 years since Thomas's death from a calculating creditor into something approaching a genuine ally, told Hester in the spring of 1885 that the Bell Ranch was the best managed property he carried paper on, and that he would extend any credit line she wanted at favorable terms. Hester thanked him and told him she did not currently need credit, which she delivered without any particular triumph, but which she felt as something clean and good. Calvin Marsh had gradually retreated from his earlier ambitions and had settled into a posture of general civic goodwill toward the Donovans, the way people often do when the thing they wanted proves to be very solidly unavailable, and when the people who have it are impossible to dislike on a personal level. He was perfectly pleasant to Hester when she came to the mercantile, and she was perfectly pleasant to him, and neither of them found this difficult. James was 8 months old and attempting seriously to stand when Hester discovered she was expecting again. She told Walter in the same kitchen, at the same table, and this time he was perhaps slightly less alarmed and somewhat more immediately joyful, and he put his hand over hers and said, "The ranch keeps growing," with a quality in his voice that was the particular flavor of a man who has looked around at his life and found it almost implausibly good. Their daughter was born in January 1886 on a cold, clear morning, and she arrived quieter than her brother but with no less determination, looking around the room from her first moments with large, dark eyes that had a quality of assessment in them that Hester recognized immediately and Walter found hilarious. "She is already deciding things," he said. "Good," Hester said. They named her Clara Me Donovan. Me for Hester's mother, who was still living, still sharp-minded at 70, and who, when she was told by letter about her granddaughter, made the trip from her home in Wichita to Caldwell in the spring to meet both grandchildren, arriving on the stage with 3 carpet bags, and the air of a woman who has been waiting for this and intends to enjoy it properly. Hester's mother, Catherine Bell, looked at Walter Donovan across the kitchen table on the evening of her arrival and said, with the directness of a woman who has raised a daughter in the Kansas frontier and does not believe in social preamble, "My daughter has told me you are a good man. Are you?" Walter looked at Catherine Bell without flinching. "I try to be," he said. "She is the better judge of it." Catherine Bell nodded once in the manner of a decision made. "Good answer," she said, and that was that. Catherine stayed 3 weeks, and during those weeks she and Walter arrived at a mutual respect that was undemonstrative and genuine. They had in common a practical view of how things ought to be, a deep regard for Hester, and an identical opinion of the quality of the Bell Ranch horses, about which Catherine was unexpectedly knowledgeable and enthusiastic. James Donovan, at 2 years old, was a compact, determined person with his father's steady brown eyes and his mother's particular quality of complete attention, and he followed Walter around the ranch with the absolute conviction of a small boy who has decided where he belongs. Walter bore this devotion with a visible tenderness that Hester found she was never quite used to, no matter how many times she saw it. The image of her tall, quiet husband crouching down in the yard to show their small son something about a horse's hoof, or carrying him on his shoulders through the south pasture in the summer evening, or reading to him in the lamplight with a patience that never varied. Clara was a different creature, quieter, more observant, slower to commit, but absolutely immovable once she had decided. She had Hester's stubbornness, which Hester recognized without apology as one of the best possible qualities, and Walter had already begun to treat her as a person of obvious substance, despite the fact that she was not yet a year old. Rafael Vargas, at 21, was by this time practically family. He had grown from a talented young hand into a genuinely skilled horseman and cattle manager, and Walter had given him increasing responsibility over the horse breeding program, which Raphael had accepted with both hands and was running with impressive competence. He had also acquired, over the preceding year, a correspondence with a young woman named Elena Salazar in San Antonio, who wrote him letters in Spanish that he read in the barn when he thought no one was looking, and which Hester had tactfully never mentioned but which she was quietly pleased about. The Bell Ranch in the summer of 1886 was 460 acres, having absorbed a small parcel of adjacent land from a family that had gone back east, and it ran 300 head of cattle and 8 horses in the breeding program and employed 3 full-time hands. It was profitable and well-regarded and entirely, completely, inarguably Hester's, which had been the point from the beginning. On a September evening in 1886, 4 years after Thomas Bell's death and 3 years after the wedding in the June church, Hester and Walter sat on the ranch house porch in the late warm light with James asleep inside and Clara in Hester's arms, and the plains stretched out before them in every direction, going gold and amber in the low-angled sun. The cottonwoods in the creek bottom were beginning to turn. The cattle were moving slowly in the south pasture. The horses in the north paddock stood quiet in the long evening light, and from the barn came the sound of Raphael doing the evening work with a quiet efficiency that had become one of the reliable sounds of the ranch day. Walter had his arm around Hester's shoulders, and she was leaning against him with Clara drowsing in her arms, and they were not talking about anything because there was nothing that particularly needed to be said. This was one of the things she had come to love most about their life together, the quality of the silence between them, which was not an absence of communication but a form of it, a register in which everything that had already been understood could simply rest without being restated. She thought about the cemetery in the October of 1882. She thought about the 22 men and their condolences and their calculations. She thought about the fence post at the edge of the yard, and the tall man with his hat in his hands, watching but not approaching, asking nothing. She had thought then, standing in that cold churchyard with Thomas in the ground, and her future rearranged into a question she hadn't known how to answer, that the next chapter of her life would be about holding on to the land, to the ranch, to herself. She had not imagined that it would be about this, about a man who looked at everything she was and offered not rescue but company, not condolence but a future, not a solution to her problem but a place beside her in her real and actual life. "What are you thinking?" Walter said. She looked out over the plains where the light was going amber and wide. "About the cemetery," she said. 4 years ago." She felt rather than saw his nod. "What about it?" "About you at the fence," she said. "Why you stopped, why you stayed separate from it." He was quiet for a moment. "Because the rest of them had already taken up all the space there was," he said, "and I didn't have anything to offer that was worth adding to that." A pause. "I had nothing to offer you in that moment, nothing useful." "So you waited," she said. "So I waited until I did." Clara stirred in Hester's arms and resettled, making a small sound of contentment. The cattle moved in the south pasture. The cottonwoods in the creek bottom shifted in the evening wind. "I'm glad you waited," Hester said. So am I, Walter said. She turned her face up to him, and he kissed her in the September evening on the porch of the Bell Ranch with the Kansas plains going golden all around them. And Clara opened her eyes briefly, assessed the situation, and apparently found it acceptable, because she closed them again and went back to sleep. The years that followed built on one another like the courses of good stone, each one solid, each one necessary, each one made better by the ones beneath it. By 1888, the Bell Ranch had a proper name on the gate post, the Donovan Bell Ranch, because Hester had wanted both names there, and Walter had not argued with her, because Walter did not argue with things that were simply right. James Donovan at 4 was a boy who knew every horse on the property by name and could tell you each one's particular habits and preferences. He had his father's quiet way with animals and his mother's absolute certainty about her own opinions, and the combination produced a child of extraordinary confidence who was also, remarkably, very good at listening. Clara at 2.5 was conducting what could only be described as a one-woman investigation of every inch of the ranch property, and could most often be found in the company of whatever ranch dog was currently on the premises or in the garden, where she had developed a serious interest in what grew and what did not. Rafael Vargas had received a visit from Elena Salazar, who had come north with her family for business in Wichita, and had made a side trip to Caldwell that had been clearly arranged by both parties with some care. Elena was a composed, dark-eyed young woman with an obvious intelligence and an evident affection for Raphael that she expressed with a decorum that was nonetheless unmistakable. And after the visit, Raphael had come to Walter with the particular posture of a young man who is about to ask for advice that matters to him greatly. He had asked whether Walter thought it was possible to build a life in this territory as a man who was not born to it. Whether a man with his background Mexican-born, the son of a cattle hand, without land or established name, could make something real and lasting here. Walter had looked at him steadily and said that, in his experience, the territory did not care much where you came from, but cared a great deal about what you did, and that the man sitting across from him had already demonstrated more capability and loyalty in 3 years than most men showed in 20, and that any woman with sense enough to choose him would be choosing well. He had then said, practically, that if Raphael was planning to ask Elena to marry him, he ought to first secure either better wages or better prospects, and that Walter intended to offer him a partnership share in the horse breeding program if he was staying. Raphael had been silent for a long time and then said, quietly, that he intended to stay. The partnership papers were drawn up in the spring of 1888, and Elena Salazar traveled north to Caldwell that summer to marry Rafael Vargas in the same church where Walter and Hester had been married, and the Bell Donovan Ranch hosted the wedding supper that evening in the yard under a sky full of stars. With Margaret Plum's cake as promised, and the Crane brothers dancing with varying degrees of success, and James Donovan asleep on a blanket under the cottonwood tree, and Clara sitting wide awake and examining everything with those large, thoughtful eyes. Hester danced with Walter that night in the lamplight of their own yard, and he was not a graceful dancer and never had been, but he held her with the absolute certainty of a man who has found the thing he intends to hold, and she felt the familiar deep warmth of it, the bedrock warmth of a life built right. "You gave that young man his future," she said against his shoulder. "He earned it," Walter said. "You know what I mean," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then, "Someone once told me that you can offer people condolence or you can offer them something to work toward. Condolence is about the past. The other thing is about what comes next." A pause. "I believed that before I met you. You made me understand why it was true." She lifted her head and looked at him. "When did you think of it in those terms?" "At the cemetery," he said. "All those men and what they were offering you was a version of themselves, not a version of anything forward. They were asking you to grieve in a direction that benefited them." He looked at her steadily. You deserved better than that." "Yes," she said, "I did." "You still do," he said. She kissed him in the lamplight of the yard, with the dance going on around them and the night full of the sounds of a celebration properly made. And she thought that this was one of the many things about Walter Donovan that she loved most precisely because it was so consistent. He did not believe that a person's worth diminished with time or circumstance or difficulty. He believed it accumulated. He had believed that about her from a cemetery fence post 4 years ago, and he had never stopped. The decade turned. The 90s brought change to the Kansas cattle country, as they brought change to everything. The range was filling in. The wild open drives from Texas were mostly history now. The railroads had pushed south, and the territory that had once been the edge of the known American world was becoming something more settled and complex. Caldwell, which had been a raw cattle town in 1882, was becoming a proper small city, with a bank and a school and a newspaper and paved streets in the center of town. The Donovan Bell Ranch was well positioned for these changes. The horse breeding program, which Walter and Raphael had developed over nearly a decade, had become the most productive part of the operation and the best-regarded horse outfit in the southern Kansas range country. They had moved away from primarily beef cattle toward a mixed operation that also supplied horses to ranches and farms, and increasingly, to the growing agricultural settlements that were spreading across the Kansas plains. Hester managed the financial side of this evolution with the same careful arithmetic she had always applied, and the ranch not only survived the shifting economics of the era, but genuinely prospered. She had become, over the decades since Thomas's death, one of the most respected landowners in the county, respected by bankers and merchants and neighboring ranchers with a matter-of-fact directness that had never required her to ask for it. James Donovan at 10 was a serious, capable boy who had been riding since he could sit a horse, and who helped with the horse breaking in the patient way Walter had taught him, never rushing, always reading the animal first. He was going to be a horseman of consequence, which was apparent to everyone who watched him work. Clara at 8 was everything Hester had suspected she would be, a child of immovable opinion and wide-ranging interest, who was currently being educated by both her parents, by Hester in reading and arithmetic and land management, and by Walter in everything pertaining to horses and range conditions and weather reading, and who absorbed all of it with the comprehensive appetite of someone who has decided the world is interesting and intends to understand it. They had a third child, too, a daughter born in 1891, named Margaret after their good friend who had cried at the wedding and made the cake, and loved all of them with unrestrained generosity. Little Meg Donovan was 7 and looked precisely like Walter, which everyone found funny and which Hester found entirely appropriate, and who had Walter's temperament as well, that particular quality of quiet, purposeful attention that in Walter you read as steadiness, and in a 7-year-old manifested as a slightly unnerving air of knowing things. Margaret Plum, the elder, had been the first to hold all 3 children at birth, and had declared each of them the finest baby ever born in the county, which she had managed to say convincingly on each of the 3 occasions. She was still running the boarding house, still knew everything about everyone, and was still the person in Caldwell who was most personally invested in the happiness of the Donovan family, which she had decided years ago was her particular jurisdiction. On a clear October evening in 1893, the whole family was at the supper table, Walter and Hester, James at 11, Clara at 9, and little Meg at 7. And the conversation was about the horse auction that was coming up in November, and about the fence line in the northwest quarter that needed attention, and about whether James was ready to take on more responsibility with the new foal. And Walter was explaining to Meg why the gray horse in the east paddock had been favored since she'd put burrs in its mane that afternoon, with the patient firmness of a father who takes small people seriously. Hester sat at her end of the table and looked down it. She looked at her husband and her children and her table, and outside the window the 460 acres of Bell Donovan land, and she felt the weight of all of it. Not the burden kind of weight, but the solid, real kind, the weight of a thing that has been built to last. She thought about the woman who had stood in a churchyard 11 years ago in a black dress with 22 men pressing her hands. That woman had been strong and capable and stubborn and determined, and she had been right about most things, including the thing she had been most afraid of, that the grief would not end her, that the land was hers, that she was not delicate. She had been right about all of that. What she had not known, standing in the cold October of 1882, was that there was a man at the fence who would spend the next year making himself quietly indispensable, and then look at her across a kitchen table with clear, steady eyes, and tell her the truest thing anyone had ever said to her about herself. She had not known about Walter Donovan, and now she could not think about any version of any future that did not have him in it. "What are you thinking?" he said from his end of the table, and she looked up and found his eyes on her, that clear, steady Autumn Creek gaze that she had first seen across a cemetery yard and had been looking for ever since. "I'm thinking," she said, "that this is exactly what a future looks like." He held her gaze for a moment, and the quiet, particular smile she loved moved across his face, the private one, the one that was not for the world. "Yes," he said, "it is." James looked between them with the mild exasperation of an 11-year-old who does not entirely understand why his parents occasionally have conversations that seem to contain more information than the words appear to carry, and said, "Can we talk about the horse auction?" "Yes," Walter said, without looking away from Hester for just one more moment. "Let's talk about the horse auction." And the lamp burned on the table, and the children's voices filled the kitchen, and the Bell Donovan ranch stood solid on the Kansas plains under the October dark. All 460 acres of it, permanent and tended and alive. A future that had been built hand by hand and acre by acre, by two people who had found each other across a cemetery yard and decided. Against the odds and in the teeth of grief, and with the full and practical commitment of two people who understood that nothing worth having is built by wishing, they had decided to build it. Walter Donovan did the dishes that night while Hester settled the children, a thing he had done without comment since the first year of their marriage. And when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, he came to find her on the porch in the cool October dark, the same porch where they had sat 3 years earlier with the children, and the plains going amber around them. He sat beside her, and she leaned against him in the way she always did, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her. The Kansas dark spread wide before them with more stars than any city person could imagine. "A good day," he said. "A good day," she said. The wind moved over the grass, and the cottonwoods in the creek bottom spoke in their October voices, and the cattle were quiet, and the horses were quiet, and the Bell Donovan ranch rested under the enormous Kansas sky, the way something rests when it has been made right fully, without apology, without tension, completely at home in what it is. This was the future he had offered her. This was the future she had chosen. And every acre of it, every child in it, every morning and evening of it, had been worth every risk of opening a heart that grief had made careful, and a future that loss had made uncertain. She had been offered condolences by 22 men. She had been offered a future by one. And the future, as it turned out, was everything.